In this video, we'll walk through installing Windows 10 Desktop as a virtual machine using VMware Fusion. There are a lot of different reasons that you might want to run Windows 10 in a virtualized environment, whether you're developing, playing with new applications that you're not sure might break a system, or, as is of particular interest to me, if you want to do any kind of security experiments. It's a very, very helpful way to give yourself a lot of options, take some snapshots maybe, and just not have to worry about breaking a system when you're doing stuff that might be untested. We'll just start out from my desktop here. Now, I'm using a Mac as my host operating system, but this installation procedure should work very similarly whether you're using Windows or Linux or really any host operating system that VMware supports. So the first thing we'll do is head on down and start VMware Fusion. That will bring up my virtual machine library. So I'll just go up here to the plus icon and choose to create a new virtual machine. Next, I'll select the installation method. There's many options, but we're just going to install from a disk or image. So I'll click continue, and that'll let me choose the disk or disk image that I want to use. I've installed Ubuntu before, but that's okay. I can just navigate to my Windows 10 installation media, which is in my downloads folder, open that, and now that becomes an option that I can use to install to this new virtual machine. So we'll click continue there. Now, I'm not going to use Easy Install. Easy Install will just do everything for me, but I'd like to take us through this whole process step by step. Now I'll choose what kind of boot firmware I want to use. I could use UEFI Secure Boot, but I'm not going to do that right at this moment because I do want to use this for security, so I want to leave that option off. And we'll use UEFI firmware, but we won't enable the UEFI Secure Boot option. Now, I'm doing that because I want to experiment with security with this virtual machine, as I've mentioned. So I'd like to see what things look like from a security posture without that option enabled. And I can always create a new virtual machine or change the configuration if I want to turn that on to see what benefits we get out of it. So we'll go ahead and click continue there, and that will bring up our finish screen, which shows us how our virtual machine will be set up, what kind of settings are going to be set by default. But let's customize that by clicking Customize Settings and give this a different name. I'm just going to call it Windows 10 Test because that's meaningful for me for this VM, but you can call it whatever makes sense to you. We'll click Save, and that will bring us to our settings screen. Now, this shows us everything that we can adjust as far as the settings for our virtual machine. For example, we can choose how many processor cores or how much memory our virtual machine will have access to from our host system. We can also change several different other options, but we're going to go ahead and leave these as they are by default. I do want to check that Enable Shared Folders is not set. Right, I don't want to share between my host and my virtual machine, at least yet. Let's leave everything isolated for the moment because we can, again, go back and enable these things later on if we decide we want to. So the next thing we'll do is press the big play button to boot our virtual machine. Now, keep an eye out because we will have to press a key to boot from the CD or DVD. In this case, that's the installation media. But this is just the same as if we had taken a physical DVD, put it into a physical system, and booted the computer from the installation DVD. We're just using that installation media that we downloaded earlier. So the Windows installer will start. It'll ask us several questions. I'm going to leave my keyboard and language and time and currency formats the same as default because I happen to be using English US, but you can change those if you like. And then we'll click Install Now. At this point, we'll just kind of walk through the setup process. There are going to be long periods during the setup process where we're waiting for things to install, waiting for updates to apply. So I will fade the video in and out to skip the waiting periods, and we'll just take a look at the important parts where we actually have to interact with the installer. This is just accepting the license terms, so I always recommend reading through these, but then we can just click the checkbox and choose Next. And we're going to want to choose the Custom Install Windows Only option when we're actually working our way through this. So we'll allow it to use the entire virtual volume that we set up. If you recall from the settings page, that was 60 gigabytes, so we'll just use that whole thing for the operating system. Once we click Next there, the Windows installer will show us what it's doing as it's doing it, and eventually we'll get to the point where Windows wants to restart. We can just let it count down, or if we're not monitoring it, it'll count down and do that for us, or we can click the Restart Now button to let it restart. Once it restarts, it'll continue the installation process, giving us messages here and there telling us what's going on at the moment. And eventually we'll get to the point where it's going to start asking us to make some configuration decisions again. The first thing that will happen is Cortana will come up and kind of introduce itself. Notice that you can actually go down to the little sound icon at the bottom right and turn off the voiceover if you choose to. I usually do that, but it's a pleasant enough thing to listen to if you want to. So we can go down and click on that and turn the volume all the way down on it if you'd like to mute that. Now it's going to ask us some questions just about what region are we in. Once you choose that, it'll ask you about the keyboard layout again. These are just those options that allow it to decide whether you have a second keyboard or not, but these are just those options that you use to customize your Windows installation. And then it's going to go ahead and check for updates. I always recommend applying any updates that any operating system you happen to be installing finds right off the bat. Let's always make sure we start with a fully updated operating system, no matter what you're going to end up doing with it. The installer will give you several messages about how it doesn't want you to interfere with the update process so we don't mess things up. And eventually, when it's done with the first round of updates, it'll restart. Once it reboots, it's going to want you to create an account, and by default, it's going to want you to sign in with some sort of Microsoft account. I actually prefer not to do this. By the way, if you auto-click on Next, it will actually won't go through and mess things up, so that's okay. But I would rather use a local account for a virtual machine that I just want to experiment with, so I'll go down and use domain login instead. Then I can just create a local user that I'll use to actually run on this particular system. Now, if you want to use a Microsoft account, you certainly can, and that's, again, the default option. But in this case, we'll go ahead and create this local user. Now, I've put in my name, Jason Eric Johnson. I'll enter a password here, and it's going to want you to type the password twice to make sure you get it right. If they're not the same, then you'll get this message saying that the passwords don't match, and you can try again. So this time I'll type the same password both times. And once I do that and click Next, we'll move on to the next step. It'll ask for a hint for my password. Now, it's not going to let you click Next and just move through this. For a local account, it's going to require that you use some kind of hint. If you do type in some sort of hint that will remind you of what the password is, make sure it's not something that will allow someone to guess your password. I just typed hint here, but definitely don't type, your password hint as, hey, it's my birthday, or something like that. Eventually, it's going to ask you if you want to make Cortana your personal assistant, and I'm actually going to say no to this and a lot of other stuff as well. When I'm creating a virtual machine just to mess around with, I actually like to start by configuring things with as few things enabled as possible. All right, so I'm going to go through these privacy settings. I'm going to turn off all of these settings so that I'm not giving out my location or diagnostic information. I'm not sending speech patterns to Microsoft. I'm not doing any of this stuff because I can enable these later if I want to. But if I do all this, I can start out with a system that's as contained as possible, and that's what I like to have as a starting point. Now the installer is going to do a bunch more polishing things up and getting things set up, and eventually it'll get back to the point where it's checking for updates again. So we'll pick it up there. And here we see the installer checking for updates one more time. And it's actually going to find one, a fairly important one, so that's good news. It's going to tell us about it here. Now, this little networks dialog will pop out of the right by default. It's going to ask if you want your VM actually to be discoverable. Keeping with the idea of keeping things as contained as possible, I'm going to select no on this. And then we'll be back to our message saying that our PC has an update waiting. Now, this update, it tells us, has a bunch of new Windows 10 features, but the thing that catches my eye is that it contains the latest security updates, and I'm always interested in that. So even though it tells us it's a 3 gigabyte download, I'm going to go ahead and do that right away to make sure that, again, we're going to be as updated as we possibly can before we start doing anything with this virtual machine. So let's get it taken care of during setup now and just get it out of the way. Once the download of the update is complete, it'll go through the process of verifying that it downloaded correctly. And finally, it will install the update. Once it's done with the installation, it will inform you that it needs to reboot, and just like before, it'll give you a little countdown timer telling you how long you have until it reboots automatically, or you can just click the Restart Now button to do it right away. Once the VM comes back up, it'll tell you that it's applying these updates and making the changes that it needs to. It'll also let you know that the PC might restart several times, and it will. So we'll just wait for that process to finish up. Once that process completes, we'll come up to our welcome screen and we'll actually log into our VM for the first time. So it will want you by default to log into that account we set up earlier. So you just type your password, and then we'll have another round of updates that we'll need to apply. And so we'll just wait for the post first login updates to do what they need to do. Now, once that's all done and the operating system is up and we can use it, we'll see that we have some notifications. I always recommend checking on those to see if it's anything we kind of care about or need to deal with right away. One of the things is it says it's searching for display drivers. By the way, when these notifications come up, we can always go down and click this little right arrow to get rid of them. But we can take care of the display drivers and a few other things by installing something from the virtual machine menu in VMware Fusion called Install VMware Tools. So this is a set of tools, and they have them for just about any operating system you can think of, that will take care of installing display drivers for you so that things will look a lot better and various other things. Now, it does say that if you don't see it start, you can always kick off the setup.exe program, but we'll just hit continue. Now, if we need to kick it off manually, we can go to File Explorer. Then we choose this PC, and we'll see that the VMware Tools installation media has automatically mounted. But this notification tells us, oh, it did see that that DVD is there. So we can click on that and then just choose to run the setup program. And once we do that, the VMware Tools installer will kick off. It'll ask us if we want to allow that to happen, and we'll say yes. And then we'll just sort of follow the prompts and install VMware Tools on our virtual machine so that the display will be better, things will look better, we'll be able to resize the window, and it will dynamically adjust the resolution for us. VMware Tools really does make using a GUI-based operating system a whole lot nicer in a virtual machine. As we see here, there are several options. I always just go with typical. I'm not intending to run this VM on multiple VMware products, and I don't really need to customize where things are, so let's just choose typical and go from there. Here's where the video driver installs, and as we can see here, it looks a whole lot better already. And once the installer is finished, it tells us that we need to reboot the virtual machine in order for all the changes to take effect. So let's just go ahead and do that right away. Once it's done rebooting, we can just go ahead and log in like usual. And at this point, we're just about ready to use our system. Our last step will be to go ahead and activate our Windows installation. We can go down to the little Windows icon here and to the gear wheel for settings and pull up the settings application. Now this allows us to do a lot of different administrative stuff with our Windows installation, like link our phones or personalize our background, change the time and language. But the important thing right now is this little message at the bottom of the screen that says Windows isn't activated. Activate Windows now. So we'll go ahead and click on that, and this will bring us to the activation page. Now, this red text up here is nothing to worry about. That's operating under the assumption that you've upgraded from an earlier version of Windows that hadn't been activated. But we'll go down and take a look at the change product key link here. And when we click on that, that's just going to go ahead and open up a dialog where we can enter the product key that we bought from Microsoft or from whatever reseller we happen to get our installation from. So once we click that, we'll just get this very simple dialog, and we'll go ahead and enter our product key. Now, I'm just going to paste my product key that I purchased in here, and the blurring I've put in there myself. That's not something you'll see in your installation, but I'm the only one who gets to know what my product key is. And once I've done that, click Next, and then I clicked Activate. It will go out to Microsoft servers. It will verify that my license key is valid, and you'll see some changes to that activation page in the background, and eventually the whole process will be done, and we will have a fully activated version of Windows 10 on our virtual machine, and we'll be ready to use it however we decide we want to use it. Now, just to verify, I can go down to the Windows icon, go to Settings again, and we'll see that that activation message isn't there anymore. And from this point on, we are all set